She climbed into his truck, soaking wet, holding her daughter like the world was collapsing around her, and she still refused to tell him her name. Maddox Granger had pulled strangers from ditches before. He'd carried wounded men through worse conditions than a Colorado blizzard. But something about this woman, the way her eyes moved before her head did, the way she angled her body between her child and every window, told him this was no ordinary accident. It told him someone had run them off that road on purpose, and whoever did it wasn't finished. If this story already has you hooked, hit that subscribe button right now, because every week we bring you stories that will keep you up at night. Drop a like and tell us in the comments, what city and country are you watching from? We want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that mountain road. The snow started falling in the early afternoon, light and polite, the kind that made Silver Pines look like something off a Christmas card. By 4 o'clock it had turned mean. By 6, the mountain road that cut north toward the ridge was invisible under 8 inches of new powder, and the wind had picked up enough to rattle the storm windows on Maddox Granger's farmhouse like something was trying to get in. Maddox didn't mind the storm. He'd been in worse places than a Colorado winter. He was under the kitchen sink, fixing a drain that had been slow since October, his forearms slick with rust-colored water, when his 8-year-old son appeared in the doorway, still wearing his snow boots, inside the house. "Dad, there's lights out by the ridge road." Maddox didn't look up immediately. "Close the door. You're letting cold air in. They're not moving." That made him look up. Toby was a quiet kid, the kind who didn't manufacture drama. If Toby said the lights weren't moving, the lights weren't moving. Maddox pulled himself out from under the sink and crossed to the window, wiping his hands on a rag. Through the heavy curtain of falling snow, roughly half a mile out where the old access road bent toward the ridge, he could just make out the faint glow of what looked like headlights tilted at the wrong angle. Not the angle of a car stopped on a road. The angle of a car that had gone off one. He stood there for 3 seconds, thinking about it. Then he grabbed his coat. "Lock the door behind me," he told Toby. "Don't open it for anyone. What if it's someone hurt? I'll bring them here if they are." "Lock it, Tob." The cold hit him like a wall the moment he stepped outside. Maddox pulled the truck's heater on full before he'd even cleared the driveway, though he knew it wouldn't matter. The cab wouldn't warm up before he reached the road. He drove slowly, headlights cutting through blowing snow that made the world look like static on a dead television channel. The wind pushed against the truck's broadside, hard enough to feel it through the wheel. He found the SUV about 40 yards off the road, nose down in the ditch where the shoulder gave out. It was a big vehicle, a late-model luxury SUV, the kind that cost more than Maddox made in 2 years, and it had rolled. The passenger side was caved inward. One headlight was still burning, aimed uselessly at the snowbank. The other had gone dark. Maddox parked, grabbed his flashlight, and went down into the ditch. The driver's door was hanging open. The driver was gone. Not injured and wandered off, gone, just gone, with no blood on the snow near the door and no tracks leading away. The snow was falling hard enough that recent tracks would fill fast, but not that fast. Whoever had been behind that wheel had left deliberately, and not long ago. He swept his flashlight through the vehicle. In the back seat, pressed against the far door, with a small child held tight against her chest, was a woman. She was maybe 30, dark hair, soaked through and tangled. A coat that probably cost $800 and was doing very little for her now. A cut above her left eyebrow, not deep but bleeding steadily enough to have tracked down into her eyelashes. She was staring straight at him with the kind of stillness that wasn't calm, it was control. The difference between someone who was okay and someone who was barely holding their composure together with both hands. The child was maybe 5 or 6, curled against the woman's side with her eyes closed. Maddox couldn't tell if she was unconscious or just exhausted. He pulled open the rear door carefully. "Hey," he said. "My name's Maddox. I live about half a mile up. Are either of you hurt?" The woman's eyes moved to his face, then to the flashlight, then so quickly he almost missed it to the open driver's door behind him, as if checking whether anyone else had come with him. "The little girl," she said. Her voice was steadier than it had any right to be. She hit her head. "She's breathing. She's been in and out." "Okay, let's get her into the truck first. Who else is with you?" "Nobody." She looked at him a second longer. Then she shifted, handing the child toward him carefully. The girl stirred and made a small sound and grabbed at the woman's coat. "It's okay, Penny." The woman's voice changed entirely when she spoke to the child. The control dropped out of it, replaced by something softer and more desperate. "It's okay. This man is going to help us." Maddox took Penny up into his arms. She was light and shivering, her small fingers immediately curling into the collar of his coat. She smelled like expensive soap and cold air. He looked back at the woman. "Can you walk?" She was already climbing out of the vehicle, and he could see her wince when she put weight on her left leg, but she didn't say anything about it. She just straightened, looked at him steadily, and said, "I'll manage." "What's your name?" A pause, just long enough to notice. "Claire," she said. Toby had the door open before Maddox got to the porch, because of course he did. 8 years old and already incapable of following simple instructions when he thought someone needed help. Maddox couldn't decide whether that was a problem or the best thing about him. "Oh no," Toby breathed, looking at Penny, who was awake now, and clutching Maddox's neck and staring at Toby with enormous wary eyes. "Get some blankets," Maddox told him. From the hall closet. "The heavy ones. Is she okay?" "Blankets, Toby." Toby ran. Maddox carried Penny inside and laid her on the couch. The woman Claire came in right behind him, limping slightly, and crouched beside Penny immediately, taking the girl's face in both hands, checking her pupils, running her fingers carefully along the back of the girl's skull. "You know what you're doing," Maddox said. It wasn't really a question. "I've had some first aid training." That wasn't a complete answer. It was also delivered with the same careful steadiness as everything else she'd said, and Maddox noted that the way a person noticed a car pulling too close on the highway, filed it away without making a scene about it. Toby came back with an armful of blankets and stopped in the doorway, taking in the situation with the particular seriousness of a child who understood something was wrong but hadn't decided to be frightened by it yet. "What's her name?" he asked. "Penny," the woman answered without looking up. "I'm Toby." He came forward and held out one of the blankets to Penny directly, instead of handing it to the adults. "This one's the warmest. It's mine, but you can have it tonight." Something crossed the woman's face when he did that. Something that moved through quickly, but had weight behind it. "Thank you, Toby," she said quietly. Maddox built the fire up in the living room hearth and got both of them warm, while he checked Penny over as carefully as he knew how. The girl had a goose egg on the back of her head and a scrape on her forearm, but her eyes were responsive, and she was talking in single syllables, which was something. A doctor would have been better, but the road north was buried under half a foot of new snow and getting worse, and emergency services in this part of Colorado took their time even in good weather. He made soup. It was canned, the kind from the back of the pantry, because there wasn't time for anything better, and he heated it on the stove while Toby sat on the floor next to Penny and showed her his collection of smooth stones he'd found along the creek over the past 2 summers, describing each one with the quiet authority of someone who had thought very carefully about rocks. Penny listened with her blanket pulled up to her chin and watched him with the suspicious attention of a small person who had learned not trust new things quickly, but who was slowly, visibly deciding that Toby might be an exception. The woman called Claire sat at the kitchen table watching Maddox stir soup. "You live here alone?" she asked. "Just you and your son?" "Yeah." "No one else coming tonight?" He looked at her over his shoulder. "You already asked that." "I know." He put the spoon down and turned to face her properly. "Who are you running from?" She met his eyes. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I'm not running from anyone. We had an accident. Your driver left the scene before I got there. No blood near the door, so he wasn't hurt. He just left." He kept his voice level. "That's not an accident situation. That's something else." The silence was long enough that the only sounds were the fire snapping in the next room, and Toby telling Penny about a piece of quartz he'd named Gerald. "I don't know who I can trust right now," she finally said. "Not aggressive, not evasive, just honest. I'm sorry." "That probably sounds crazy." "It doesn't," Maddox said. "It sounds like someone who's been in a bad situation long enough to stop assuming everyone's on their side." He held her gaze. "So I'll tell you what I told my son. Until that road opens, you don't have to go anywhere. And until that road opens, nobody touches you or your daughter." She looked at him for a long moment, something working behind her eyes. "You don't even know me," she said. "No," he agreed. "But you're in my house, and she's 6 years old." He nodded toward the living room, where the sound of Toby's rock lectures was continuing at full pace. "That's enough for me." Later, after Penny had fallen asleep on the couch, and Toby had relocated himself to the armchair, where he dozed off mid-sentence, the woman called Claire stood at the window in the darkened kitchen, looking out at nothing just snow and dark and more snow. She thought Maddox was busy with the dishes. She let her shoulders drop for the first time since the crash, and in that unguarded moment she looked exhausted down to the marrow. Maddox was at the counter, not moving, watching the reflection of her face in the dark window above the sink. She looked nothing like someone having a bad night. She looked like someone whose entire life had just gone sideways, and who had been holding the weight of it upright, through sheer will, since it happened. "There's a bedroom at the end of the hall," he said quietly. She startled. Just slightly, her shoulders came back up. "You can lock it from the inside," he added. "Toby's on the couch. I'll stay up." "You don't need to stay up, I know." She turned from the window. There was something in her expression that had nothing to do with gratitude. It was something more complicated than that. Something that looked almost like grief, though he didn't know yet what she was grieving. "Thank you," she said, "for what you did tonight. I mean that." "Don't thank me yet," Maddox said. "Sleep first." She almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. Maddox sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours after everyone was asleep, in the dark, with a cup of coffee gone cold in front of him and his phone on the table beside it. He didn't sleep. He hadn't slept easily in years. That was something the military and then grief had done to him, rewired his nervous system until real rest felt irresponsible. He'd run the plates on the SUV while he was still out at the ditch. The registration had come back to a leasing company in Denver, the kind of leasing company that handled corporate fleets, high volume, anonymous, the kind of account that insulated whoever actually paid the bill. No name on the other end, just the company. He sat with that information and turned it over without doing much with it yet. She'd told him her name was Claire. She'd checked twice whether he'd come alone. Her driver had walked away from an accident scene in a blizzard, which meant either the driver had been scared of something worse than the blizzard, or he'd been part of whatever created it. The child was real. The fear was real. The cut above her eye was real. Everything else had the careful edges of a story assembled rather than remembered. He didn't hold that against her. People in bad situations learned quickly to trust no one until trust was proven, not offered. He'd done the same thing in places a lot less comfortable than a Colorado snowstorm. But somebody had run that car off the road, and whatever that somebody wanted from the woman sleeping at the end of his hallway, they didn't know yet that she was here. Maddox looked at the front door, the side windows, the kitchen entry. Then he refilled his coffee and settled back into the chair. The storm pushed hard against the side of the farmhouse, rattling the glass, testing everything it could reach. He let it. She woke before anyone else in the house. That was habit. Celeste Hawkridge had not slept past 5:30 on a weekday in 11 years, and the habit had long since stopped caring what day of the week it was. She lay still for a moment in the narrow bed at the end of Maddox Granger's hallway, listening to the farmhouse breathe around her. The wind had dropped overnight. The silence that replaced it was the heavy cotton silence of deep snow, the kind that swallowed sound before it could travel, that made the world feel smaller and further away than it actually was. She looked at the ceiling, water stain in the corner, old and pale, the kind that had been there long enough nobody noticed it anymore. A curtain rod slightly crooked on one side. A lamp on the nightstand with a shade that sat at a 5-degree tilt because one of the wire supports had bent and nobody had bothered straightening it. An ordinary room, a modest room. The kind of room she hadn't slept in since she was 22 years old and sharing a studio apartment with 2 other women while she was finishing her engineering degree and working shifts at a logistics warehouse on weekends to cover textbooks. That felt like someone else's life now. Most of the time it did. This morning, staring at that tilted lampshade, it felt very close. She sat up carefully. Her left leg had stiffened overnight. She'd hit it against something in the SUV during the roll, and the bruising ran from her knee to mid-thigh in a deep, unhappy purple that she'd checked privately in the bathroom mirror the night before, and then not looked at again. She could walk. She'd walked on worse. She dressed quietly, moved to the door, unlocked it, and opened it an inch. Listened. Nothing from the hallway. Nothing from the main room. Then the very faint sound of coffee being made. She pushed the door open and followed the smell. Maddox was at the stove with his back to her, and from the angle of his shoulders she was fairly certain he already knew she was there, before she'd taken 3 steps into the kitchen. He didn't turn around immediately. He poured coffee into a second mug she hadn't asked for any, hadn't made a sound and set it on the counter beside his own. "Penny's still asleep," he said. "Toby too. Checked on both of them an hour ago." Celeste came to the counter and picked up the mug. It was heavy ceramic, the kind with a chip on the handle, warm all the way through. She drank without saying anything for a moment. "You didn't sleep," she said. "I slept some." She looked at him. He hadn't. His eyes had the particular flatness of someone running on caffeine and willpower, The kind of flatness she recognized because she'd seen it in mirrors during the worst quarters of building Oromont from the ground up. When the company was 2 years old and bleeding money, and she'd gone 72 hours without real sleep twice in the same month. You sat up all night watching the house, she said. He turned from the stove and leaned against the counter across from her, wrapping both hands around his own mug. Roads are still closed. Forecast says another 6 to 8 inches before noon. That's not an answer. Yeah, he said. I know. The kitchen was gray with early light coming through snow-fogged windows. It smelled like coffee and old wood and something faint and clean underneath like. The house had a particular smell the way people do, something that had seeped into the walls over years and wasn't going anywhere. I need to tell you something, Celeste said. Okay. She looked down at her mug. This was the part she'd been turning over since 3 in the morning, lying in the narrow bed, listening to the house settle and creak. She'd run the calculation, trust no one against the specific man who had pulled her out of a ditch at midnight in a blizzard and given her daughter his son's blanket and stayed up all night sitting between them and whatever was outside. The math wasn't clean, it never was, but it was the best math she had. My name isn't Claire, she said. He didn't react. Not in any visible way. I know, he said. She looked up. You know, your daughter called you Mama twice last night. The third time she half woke up scared and she called you by name. He held his mug steady. She said, Celeste. Kids don't use their parents' first name unless they've heard other people say it a lot, usually in professional settings. Celeste stared at him. I also ran the plates on the SUV, he added, without apology. And corporate fleet account, Denver-based. The kind of account that has enough volume that it doesn't tie back to an individual name easily. But it narrows things. He watched her. You want to tell me the rest, or do you want me to guess? Celeste set her mug down on the counter. Then she pulled out the chair at the kitchen table and sat down, and something in that motion, the deliberateness of it, the decision in it was the same thing she did at the start of board meetings when she'd already made the call and was sitting down to execute it. My full name is Celeste Hawkridge, she said. I'm the founder and CEO of a company called Oromont Technologies. It's a logistics and aerospace firm based in Denver. About 48 hours ago, I discovered that someone inside my own executive team has been stealing from the company's systematic fraud through falsified contracts, probably running 18 months back, maybe longer. I was putting together documentation to take to federal investigators. She paused. Before I could get there, someone inside the company found out that I knew. Maddox was very still across the counter, not tense, just listening with his whole body, the way people do when they're taking something seriously. The SUV was followed into the mountains, she continued. I thought we'd lost them. We hadn't. The crash, she stopped, pressed her mouth into a line for a moment. Marcus, my driver, he wasn't my driver. I think he was put there. I think he was supposed to make sure I didn't make it to the investigators. But he didn't. The crash put us in the ditch before he could do anything else. And then you were there. She looked at him evenly. He ran because you showed up, and it complicated his options. Maddox said nothing for a moment. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere down the hall, a floorboard shifted Penny or Toby, turning over in their sleep. Who's the executive? He asked. A man named Roland Vexley. He's been my CFO for 6 years. She stopped again, and for the first time something cracked slightly in her composure. Not much. Just a hairline fracture visible for a second before she smoothed it over. He's been at every board dinner. He sent flowers when Penny had her tonsils out. I trusted him with everything. The last sentence came out flat and factual, like she'd already processed the emotion behind it and filed it somewhere she didn't have to look at right now. You have proof? Maddox asked. On an encrypted drive. It's on me, and Roland doesn't know where you are. Not yet, she held his gaze. But he will figure out I didn't die in that crash. When he does, he'll start looking. He has resources. He's been running a fraud operation for 18 months without being detected. He's not careless. Maddox nodded slowly. Then he picked up his coffee and drank and was quiet for a long moment. Okay, he said finally. She blinked. Okay, you stay until the road opens. Both of you. His voice had the same flat certainty it had the night before. Not heroic. Not dramatic. Just decided. We don't use phones to reach out to anyone until we know who Roland has access to. You don't go near windows more than you have to. And when the road opens, we figure out the next step together. He paused. That work for you? Celeste looked at this man, the worn jacket draped over the chair behind him, the scar that ran along the edge of his jaw that she hadn't asked about, the coffee mug with the chipped handle, and felt something strange move through her chest. Not attraction, not yet. Something earlier than that. Something closer to recognition. That works, she said. The second day was the day Celeste stopped being able to maintain the careful distance she'd built around herself since she was 25 years old. It didn't happen all at once. It happened in pieces. It happened when she came into the living room at 9 in the morning and found Maddox attempting to braid Penny's hair. He was sitting on the low coffee table, too big for it, slightly ridiculous, with Penny standing between his knees, and the look of absolute concentration on his face suggested he was treating this braid with the same seriousness he'd applied to checking the perimeter of the house before bed. The result was not good. It was lumpy in the middle, and the elastic at the end was wrapped around itself twice, and the left side was tighter than the right by a visible margin. Penny was studying the far wall with the particular patience of a child who has decided to allow something to happen. "I've done it 3 times, Maddox said without looking up, apparently aware that Celeste had stopped in the doorway. "It's getting worse each time. Do you want me to?" "I got it." He didn't have it. Celeste pressed her lips together against a laugh that surprised her. She'd sprained her left wrist, in the crash, hadn't mentioned it, and it had swollen overnight into something that made gripping things painful. But she crossed to the couch, sat down, and watched him work in silence. He finished, stepped back and looked at it the way a man looks at a piece of machinery he's repaired with the wrong part. "That's fine," he said, with no conviction whatsoever. "It's great, Maddox," Penny said, in the solemn tone of a child being charitable. Celeste actually laughed at that. A real laugh, the kind that came out before she could organize it. Maddox looked at her sideways with an expression that was close to defensive, and she held up her good hand. It has character," she said. "It looks like I braided it with oven mitts." "A little," she admitted. He looked at Penny, then at the braid, then blew out a breath through his nose. "Come here," he said to Celeste. "Show me." She showed him, one-handed, with the right. He watched her fingers. He was a good learner, paid attention without asking her to repeat things, and by the end he had the general structure of it, if not the polish. It still wasn't neat, but it was better than it had been, and Penny examined herself in the hallway mirror and offered a diplomatic thumbs up. It was such a small moment. It cost nothing, but something in Celeste shifted a degree or two during it. Some internal calibration she'd made so long ago she'd stopped noticing it, the one that said, "Keep your distance. Stay in your lane. The people closest to you are the people best positioned to hurt you." She'd built Oromont on competence and self-sufficiency and the understanding that needing something from another person was a form of exposure. She'd raised Penny largely alone since Penny was 2, when her marriage to a man who couldn't survive her ambition had quietly collapsed. She'd told herself the work was enough. She'd told herself Penny had everything she needed. Standing in Maddox Granger's farmhouse, watching him stand at the hallway mirror and tilt his head at a crooked braid he'd made for her daughter, Celeste thought about how long it had been since anyone had done anything small and ordinary for her. Not because she was the CEO, not in exchange for something. Just because Penny was there, and her wrist was hurt, and it needed doing. Toby and Penny were inseparable by noon. Toby had a box of art supplies under his bed, and a philosophy about crayons that he explained to Penny in careful detail at the kitchen table while they colored something about how the broken ones were actually better, because you could use the edge for different effects. Penny held a broken red crayon and listened to this explanation with the gravity of a scientist being briefed on new data, and then she tried the edge technique on her paper, and from that moment forward, she was entirely in. Celeste sat at the far end of the table with Maddox's old laptop he'd offered it. She'd accepted working carefully and quietly on the documentation she'd been building before the crash. She'd memorized the structural framework of the evidence on the encrypted drive. She was rebuilding the secondary file, the redundant version she kept in her head, because Celeste Hawkridge had learned before Oromont was 2 years old that you always needed a backup. Across the table, Toby was now explaining his rock collection again, this time from a different angle, apparently having decided that Penny's appreciation of rocks during last night's first briefing warranted a follow-up session. "Gerald's the best one," he was telling her seriously. "But don't tell the others." "Can rocks hear?" Penny asked. "I don't think so. But I don't know everything yet." Penny considered this as a reasonable position and nodded. Celeste kept her eyes on the screen and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Something close to peaceful, even though she was terrified beneath it. Even though Roland Vexley was somewhere out there reassigning resources and calculating where she'd ended up. The fear hadn't gone anywhere. It was still there, a low-voltage hum under everything. But sitting at this table, In this house that smelled like coffee and old wood, watching her daughter discuss the emotional interiority of rocks with a patient 8-year-old who treated the question like it deserved genuine consideration, she felt something loosen. Maddox found her standing at the window. He'd been out to the barn to check the generator. He liked to check it twice a day when snow was heavy, an old habit, and when he came back in and scraped his boots and hung his coat and came into the kitchen, she was standing at the window, over the sink in the same spot he'd seen her the night before. But this time her posture was different. Last night she'd been looking at nothing. This time she was looking at something specific. He came to stand a few feet behind her and followed her line of sight. A vehicle far down the access road, maybe 3/4 of a mile out, parked just inside the tree line. Dark-colored. Not moving. It had not been there when he'd gone to the barn 20 minutes ago. "How long?" he asked. "I saw it about 5 minutes ago," she said. Her voice was quiet, controlled, but her hand on the countertop had gone white at the knuckles. "I thought maybe it was someone turned around. But it's just sitting there." Maddox looked at the angle of it, the distance, the way it was positioned back from the road just far enough to be off the obvious sightline from the house. Too deliberate for someone turned around. Too still for someone dealing with a stuck vehicle. "Go get Penny," he said. "Keep your voice normal, don't run." Maddox, Celeste. He turned and looked at her directly. Normal voice. "Get Penny. I need you both in the basement in the next 2 minutes." Something moved across her face, resistance, fear, the instinct of a woman who had run a billion-dollar company by never ceding control of a situation. He watched her make the decision to trust him, and he understood exactly what it cost her. "Toby too," she said. "Toby first," he agreed. "Go." She went. Maddox turned back to the window. The vehicle was still there, exactly where it had been. It had not moved toward the house. Whoever was in it was watching, assessing, waiting for something back up probably, or a specific signal. He'd had enough conversations with men who used vehicles positioned like that to know what they were doing. They weren't there to talk. He moved through the kitchen to the hallway cabinet and opened the lower panel, the one behind the extra propane cylinders that looked like storage, and was. He checked what was there. Then he straightened and pulled out his phone and opened a text thread he hadn't used in 8 months and typed 4 words. "I need a favor." The response came in 90 seconds, which meant the person on the other end was either very alert or had been waiting for exactly this kind of message from exactly this person. How bad? Maddox looked back toward the window. The vehicle was still there. "Getting worse," he typed. "I'll know more in an hour." He put the phone in his jacket pocket and went to the basement door to check on the 3 people he'd told to get out of sight, and then he went back to the window, and he sat down in the chair beside it, where he could see the tree line without being seen himself, and he waited with the particular patience of someone who had spent years learning that the worst thing you could do in a deteriorating situation was let it see you coming. The light outside was flat and gray, and the snow had started again, soft and steady, beginning to cover the tracks that vehicle had made getting into the tree line. Maddox watched it snow and thought about the way Celeste had stood at that window, with her hand white-knuckled on the counter, and the way she'd made herself let go of control, because she had the judgment to recognize when someone else needed to carry it for a minute. He thought about Penny telling Toby that she wasn't sure rocks could hear, but she appreciated his uncertainty. He thought about the encrypted drive somewhere on Celeste's person, and the man named Roland Vexley, who had sent his people into a blizzard after a woman and a 6-year-old child. He thought about a lot of things sitting at that window as the snow fell and the light died, and the dark shape among the trees sat perfectly, patiently still. Then just after 5 o'clock, when the sky had dropped to a dim gray purple and visibility was maybe 400 yards, the headlights in the tree line turned off. Not because the vehicle was leaving, because it didn't need them to see anymore. Because another set of headlights had appeared, coming up the access road from the south. Then a third. Maddox counted them. 2 vehicles approaching. 1 stationary in the trees. That was 3 vehicles. He ran the math on occupancy, on probable purpose, on the fact that Roland Vexley had had approximately 36s to realize his driver had failed, identify the general area, and mobilize people with enough confidence to come up a snow-buried mountain road in the dark. 3 vehicles was not a polite conversation. He stood, checked the cabinet in the hallway a second time, then crossed to the basement door and knocked twice, slow, deliberate, the pattern he'd told them to listen for. He heard footsteps on the basement stairs. Then Celeste's voice, close to the door, low and controlled. "What's happening?" "Company's coming," he said. "Probably 3 vehicles." I need you to stay down there with the kids regardless of what you hear. He paused. Can you do that? A beat. What are you going to do? Make sure they regret the drive up, he said. Another beat, longer. Maddox. Her voice was different now. Still controlled, but something underneath it that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite something else. Be careful. It was such a plain thing to say. He'd heard more elaborate send-offs in his life. Mission briefings, command orders, formal language designed to give weight to the moment. Somehow those 2 words, said quietly through a basement door by a woman he'd known for less than 48 hours, landed differently than any of them. Lock the door, he told her. Don't open it for anyone who doesn't knock the pattern. He heard the lock slide. He turned back to the dark farmhouse and the approaching lights beyond the window, and for the first time in 3 years, Maddox Granger felt the particular, unwelcome clarity of a man who knows exactly what the next hour is going to require of him. He hadn't wanted to go back to that version of himself. But Roland Vexley's people were coming up his road toward his house, and there was a woman and 2 children locked in his basement. Some decisions make themselves. He moved to the window and watched the lights come closer through the falling snow, and he thought, you came to the wrong house. Then he started working. The first vehicle pulled into the driveway at 5:14. Maddox watched it from the side of the living room window, standing back far enough in the dark that the glass reflected nothing, a habit so ingrained he didn't think about it anymore. A black SUV, newer than his truck by 10 years, moving slowly through the accumulated snow with the careful deliberateness of people who didn't want to announce themselves any louder than they had to. It stopped 20 feet from the porch. The engine stayed running. Nobody got out immediately. That told him something. People who stop and wait before exiting are either cautious or waiting for confirmation. Both options meant they'd talked to someone more recently than Maddox would have liked. The second vehicle came in 2 minutes later, parking just off the driveway's edge where it blocked the natural exit angle. Not accidental. Someone had thought about the geometry of this approach and given instructions accordingly. The third, the one that had been sitting in the tree line, stayed where it was, covering the back of the property, or waiting, possibly both. Maddox counted the doors. 2 men from the first vehicle, 2 from the second. He couldn't see the third clearly enough to count, but he had to assume at least 2 more. 6 people minimum, possibly 8. Operating with vehicle discipline and a pre-arranged approach pattern. That wasn't private security doing routine retrieval. That was something with more structure behind it, more money, more specific instructions about what outcome was acceptable and what wasn't. He moved away from the window before any of them reached the porch, placing himself in the kitchen doorway, where he could see the front door and both side windows simultaneously. He'd killed the interior lights 20 minutes earlier. The farmhouse was dark. From outside, it would look either abandoned or occupied by someone who'd gone to bed early, and either way it created a moment of uncertainty that he needed. The knock on the front door when it came was 3 times. Hard, official sounding, the way people knock when they want you to believe they have authority. Maddox crossed to the door and opened it without hesitating, because hesitation communicates fear, and fear changes how people make decisions. 3 men on the porch, one in front mid-40s, broad across the shoulders, a jacket that cost real money and fit well enough to hide the shape of what was underneath it on his left side. The other 2 flanking, hanging back just enough. The one in front had the practiced expression of someone who'd done this kind of door approach before, and had learned the face that worked best for it, neutral, professionally firm, designed to suggest that cooperation was the obvious and only reasonable response. Mr. Granger, the man said. Not a question. He knew the name. Yeah, Maddox said. My name is Harlan Cross. I'm with a private security firm retained by Oromont Technologies. He produced a card and held it out. Maddox took it without looking at it. We have reason to believe that 2 individuals, a woman and a young child, may have sought shelter at your property following a vehicle accident 2 nights ago. We're here to assist them. Assist them, Maddox said. That's correct. At 5:15 in the evening, in a snowstorm, with 6 men and 3 vehicles. Harlan Cross didn't change expression. Corporate security operates around the clock, Mr. Granger. The safety of Oromont's CEO is our primary concern. Maddox looked past him at the 2 flanking men, then let his gaze move briefly and deliberately to the second vehicle, parked at the driveway's edge, communicating clearly that he'd counted them and noted the positioning and wasn't going to pretend he hadn't. Then he looked back at Harlan Cross. Which firm? I'm sorry, the private security firm. Which one? A pause. Small but there, Meridian Group. Maddox had spent enough years in the world of private security contractors to know which firms operated in Colorado and what their reputations were. Meridian Group was not among them. Never heard of them, he said pleasantly. You have credentials? Licensing documentation for operating in the state? The expression on Harlan Cross's face shifted. Not dramatically, just enough. The professional neutrality developed the faintest edge beneath it. Mr. Granger, I don't think this needs to be complicated. If the women are here, we'd like to speak with them briefly and ensure their safety. That's all. Women, Maddox said. Cross blinked. I'm sorry? You said if the women are here. There's one woman. And a child. He kept his voice completely even. You just told me you don't know whether they're here. But you used the plural, which means you were told they were here, and you're running a script. The temperature on the porch dropped by several degrees that had nothing to do with the weather. Mr. Granger, there's nobody here but me and my son, Maddox said. If a woman and a child had shown up at my door during a blizzard, I'd have called emergency services, which I did. He held the man's gaze without blinking. They came out 2 hours ago. If you've got concerns about Oramont's CEO, I'd contact the Garfield County Sheriff's Office. They're the ones who handled the call. He was lying. He was lying cleanly and with complete commitment and the specific type of confidence that comes from having been trained to do exactly that in situations where a poor performance got people killed. Harlan Cross stared at him. The two flanking men exchanged a look that Maddox caught and filed. We'd like to come in, Cross said. His voice had changed slightly. The customer service quality was mostly gone. No, Maddox said. Mr. Granger, I'd strongly encourage. You're not law enforcement, Maddox said, and now his own voice changed too, not louder, not aggressive, just stripped of the conversational quality it had carried up to this point, down to something flat and factual. You have no legal right to enter this property. You've produced no verifiable credentials. You've arrived with a tactical vehicle configuration that has nothing to do with welfare checks. He looked at Cross steadily. You can stand on my porch as long as you like. You can't come in. A long moment. Snow falling between them. The porch light throwing everything in a pale yellow that made the shadows behind the two flanking men very dark. Then Cross reached into his jacket. Maddox didn't move. He simply looked at the man's hand, and something in his absolute stillness, the complete absence of flinch or retreat, made Cross stop. The hand came back out empty. We'll be in touch, Cross said. Good night, Maddox replied. He closed the door, locked it, moved immediately to the side window to watch them go, tracking the body language as they walked back to the vehicles, the angle of Cross's neck when he spoke into his phone, the tight set of the shoulders on the men behind him, the way they didn't drive out immediately, but sat for another 4 minutes in the driveway before backing out slowly. He memorized the license plates on both departing vehicles. Then he went to the kitchen and typed them into his phone and sent them to the same contact he'd messaged an hour earlier. Need these run. Fast. Also Meridian Group, supposedly Colorado-based private security. The response, give me 20. He waited until the vehicles were fully out of sight before he went to the basement door and knocked the pattern too slow, one fast, too slow. The lock slid. The door opened. Celeste was standing at the bottom of the stairs, with Penny asleep against her shoulder, the girl's legs wrapped around her waist and her face tucked against Celeste's neck. Toby was sitting on an overturned storage crate behind her. Wrapped in the emergency blanket, Maddox kept down there, awake and tracking everything, with the careful eyes of a kid who understood the situation was serious and had decided his job was to be steady. Celeste looked at Maddox's face and read it the way competent people read a situation quickly, practically, going straight to the operational information. Are they gone? She whispered, keeping her voice low for Penny. For now. He looked at Toby. You okay, bud? Yeah, Toby paused. Penny cried a little. I told her about Gerald and she stopped. Maddox looked at his son for a moment. Good thinking, he said. He took Penny from Celeste's arms. She was deeply asleep now, heavy and warm, and carried her upstairs and put her back on the couch with Toby's blanket. Toby followed without being told and settled into the armchair nearby, still watchful. Maddox straightened and found Celeste standing in the middle of the living room, arms crossed, watching him with an expression that had moved past, controlled into something complicated. Who was it? She asked. He told her. The 3 vehicles, the approach formation, the man named Harlan Cross, and the unverifiable firm called Meridian Group. He watched her face while he talked. When he said Meridian Group, something happened in her eyes. A specific recognition, Not just of the name, but of what it confirmed. Roland uses them, she said. Meridian's not a licensed firm. It's a private arrangement, 3 or 4 former law enforcement, a couple of ex-military. Roland's used them before for what he called sensitive corporate situations. Nobody on the board knew about it. She stopped. I found the payments in the financial records. That's part of what's on the drive. He sent them after you, Maddox said. Not a question. He sent them after the drive. She unfolded her arms and pressed one hand against her sternum, briefly a gesture he'd noticed she made when something landed harder than she wanted to show. The drive is the only thing that connects all of it. Without it, it's my word against his, and he's had 6 years to make himself indispensable to the board. He's been careful, and he's been patient, and he's been building a version of himself that nobody would question. Her voice was steady, but the anger beneath it was audible, the kind of anger that comes from betrayal specifically rather than just injury. He knew exactly what kind of evidence it would take to unseat him. So he made sure the only person with that evidence was. She stopped. Alone on a mountain, Maddox finished. Yes, he looked at her standing in the middle of his living room, billionaire CEO of a company with hundreds of employees, a woman who'd built something from the ground up through sheer force of intelligence and persistence, looking like someone who'd just had the floor tilted 45 degrees under her feet, was still working out how to stand. He'll come back, she said. Not those men. Different ones, or the same ones differently deployed. He knows we're here now. Probably, Maddox agreed. So what do we do? He'd been thinking about that since he closed the front door. The equation was different now, not just shelter and wait, but active and deteriorating. Roland's people had confirmed her location. Any move she made toward law enforcement through normal channels would be anticipated. Roland had had 2 days to begin building his counter-narrative, and Maddox had seen enough institutional corruption to know that a well-resourced and patient man with 6 years of established credibility could make significant problems for an official investigation before it even got started. I have some contacts, he said. Former military. People who've worked in areas adjacent to financial crimes investigations, federal level. Not official channels, not the kind that Roland can see coming through normal routing. He paused. I need to make some calls tonight, and I need the drive. Celeste looked at him. Not to take it, he said. To understand what's on it well enough to know which part of it matters most and who's the right person to receive it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she reached into the inside pocket of her jacket. She'd been wearing it even indoors, he'd noticed. The encrypted drive always on her person, and held it out. He took it. It was smaller than he'd expected. A standard-looking USB drive, matte black, no markings. The kind of thing that looked completely unremarkable until you understood what it contained. Nobody's cracked the encryption, he asked. Nobody's going to. I built the encryption architecture personally. She held his gaze. I'm not just a CEO, Maddox. Before Ormont was Ormont, I was an engineer. Cryptographic systems were my specialty. He turned the drive over in his hand once, then put it in his own jacket pocket. Get some sleep if you can. I'll be in the kitchen. You're going to sit up again. I'm going to make phone calls, he said, and then probably sit up. Something almost like exasperation crossed her face. You can't run on no sleep indefinitely. I've done it before. That doesn't make it a good system. No, he agreed. It doesn't. He met her eyes briefly. Good night, Celeste. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't entirely read, something between frustration and something warmer, and then she said goodnight and went down the hall. The calls took 2 hours. The first was to a man named Decker, who had spent 8 years in naval intelligence, and now did something vaguely dubbed as private consulting that Maddox had long ago stopped asking specific questions about. Decker was efficient, unemotional, and had a memory for institutional connections that bordered on alarming. Maddox described the situation in the flat, precise shorthand of 2 people who'd worked in the same professional language, no flourishes, no editorializing, just the relevant facts in the relevant order. When he finished, Decker was quiet for 4 seconds, which for Decker was a long time. Ormont Technologies, Decker said. Yeah, Roland Vexley. Maddox felt the back of his neck go still. You know the name? I know the name from somewhere else, Decker said slowly. Give me a day. There's a thread here I've seen before. I just need to find the other end of it. I don't know how much time we have. I understand that. I'll be quick. A pause. The CEO is there with you? She's safe? For now. Keep it that way. This might be bigger than one company's CFO skimming contracts. That was all Decker would say about it. Maddox took the implication and didn't push. The second call was shorter, a former colleague who still worked law enforcement adjacent, a woman named Petra who owed him a favor that was now several years old and who he'd been hoping never to collect. He gave her the license plates. She came back in 40 minutes with information that confirmed what he'd already suspected and made the rest of it considerably worse. Both vehicles were registered to shell companies. The shell companies traced back through 2 layers of corporate registration to a holding firm in Denver with no public-facing identity. The Meridian Group had no state licensing, no legitimate business registration, and one of the 2 plates had appeared in a separate incident report filed 18 months ago in connection with a suspected corporate espionage case in Boulder that had been quietly dropped before charges were filed. Whoever this Roland is, Petra said, he's been running this infrastructure for a while. This isn't improvised. No, Maddox agreed, it's not. You need to be careful, Maddox. People who've been careful this long get very uncareful very fast when they think they're about to lose everything. He thanked her and hung up. He sat in the dark kitchen with the drive on the table in front of him and his cold coffee and turned the whole picture over slowly. Roland Vexley had been stealing from Ormont for at minimum 18 months. He had a private enforcement apparatus that had been operational long enough to appear in at least one prior incident. He'd tried to eliminate Celeste before she could reach investigators, and when that failed, he'd mobilized quickly enough to locate her within 36 hours in a remote mountain location during a blizzard. This was not a CFO who'd gotten greedy and made some bad decisions. This was a man who'd spent years building a parallel operation inside a legitimate company, with full awareness of what he was doing and full preparation for the possibility that it might unravel. Which meant when it started to unravel, he wasn't going to stop at one attempt. The news hit at 7 in the morning. Maddox heard it from the kitchen. He'd finally slept 2 hours on the couch and woken at 6 with the particular alertness of someone whose body has decided that's all it's getting, and he had the small countertop radio on low while he made breakfast when the local Denver affiliate's morning report mentioned Ormont Technologies. He turned the volume up. The report was careful in its language the way reports are careful when someone has put a significant amount of effort into the way the information is framed. The anchor described serious concerns raised by members of Ormont's board regarding financial irregularities discovered in connection with Celeste Hawkridge's recent actions. It described her as currently unreachable. It referenced confidential corporate documents that she had allegedly removed from company servers without authorization. By the time it finished, Maddox had the eggs off the heat and his jaw set hard. He heard footsteps in the hallway. Celeste, who had apparently already been awake, because she appeared in the kitchen doorway with the expression of someone who has just heard exactly what they were afraid they were going to hear. He moved fast, she said. Yeah, he's been sitting on that narrative, waiting to deploy it. She came into the kitchen and stood at the counter, not sitting, not moving toward the coffee, just standing very still with her hands at her sides. The board suspended me. The report said, I know what the report said. It means he already had them. Her voice was flat. He's been working the board for months. Probably since he realized I was getting close. He built the case against me before I ever had a chance to make one against him. She looked at the radio as if she could stare through it to the man on the other side of it. My accounts will be frozen within 24 hours. The company's legal team will be instructed to treat me as hostile. Every person inside Ormont who might have helped me is now choosing between their jobs and a woman the board has already suspended. She paused. He's very good at this. He's cornering you, Maddox said. He's already cornered me. She looked at him. He doesn't need to corner me. He just needs to wait until I have nothing left and then offer me a way out that involves giving him the drive and disappearing. Her chin came up slightly. And the worst part is that version of this ends with him winning and me gone, and every employee at Ormont working for a man who's been stealing from them for a year and a half. Maddox watched her face. The anger was there, the genuine, coal-hot anger of someone watching an injustice execute itself with efficiency, but underneath it was something else. Something that was almost worse than fear. It was the particular despair of a person who has built their entire life around competence and preparation, who has always found a way, and who is now running the numbers and not finding one. He'd seen that look before. He'd worn it himself once, standing in a hospital corridor at 2 in the morning, after the doctor finished explaining what the word inoperable actually meant in practice. He put the eggs in a bowl and set them on the table. Sit down, he said. Maddox, I don't think. Sit down and eat something. You haven't eaten since yesterday afternoon. He pulled out the chair. You can't run the math on an empty stomach and no sleep. I know that's not what you want to hear. Do it anyway. She looked at him. Then she sat down. He told her about Decker while she ate. Not everything. He'd spent enough years in operational contexts to understand the value of not sharing information faster than the situation required it, but enough. He told her that he had a contact with Federal Adjacent Reach who had recognized Roland Vexley's name from a separate context, who was working on identifying a larger thread. Celeste stopped eating when he said that. Larger how? I don't know yet. Decker was being careful about it. He'll be in touch today. She looked at him steadily. You think Roland's operation extends beyond Oromont? I think Decker recognized the name from somewhere, and Decker doesn't make that face unless the somewhere matters. He sat down across from her with his own coffee. What do you know about Oromont's government contracting relationships? The question landed and she went very still. We have 4 active federal contracts, she said slowly. Logistics infrastructure. 2 are defense adjacent. She paused. Roland managed the procurement relationships on 2 of them. For how long since they were signed? Her voice had gone quieter. 2 years ago. She set her fork down. If he was manipulating the contract terms, if the fraud extended to federal contracts. Then it's not a corporate case, Maddox said. It's a federal case. Which means the kind of investigators who get involved are not the kind who can be neutralized by a suspended CEO Zinzi's credibility problems with her board. Celeste sat back in her chair. He watched the information move through her, the engineer's mind processing the implications, running the architecture, finding the weight-bearing point. He knows that too, she said. Yes. If we go that direction, if federal investigators start pulling the contracting records, he can't contain it. He can't manage it the way he's been managing the board. She looked at Maddox. That's why he wants the drive so badly. Not just because of what it proves about the Oromont fraud. It's because the drive has the contracting records too. Does he know that? He knows I was building a comprehensive case. He knows I'm thorough. She almost smiled, and it was the grimly specific smile of a woman who's been underestimated by someone who knew her well enough to know better. He knows that if I found one thread, I pulled on all of them. A sound from the next room, Penny's voice, sleepy and vague, calling for Mama. Celeste pushed back from the table immediately, and the shift from executive to mother was instantaneous. No transition between them. Just 2 things that were both entirely real and occupied the same person without contradiction. I'll be right back, she said. Maddox sat with his coffee and thought about the federal contracting angle while he listened to Celeste's voice in the next room go through the register change he'd noticed before from controlled to something softer and more fundamental. He thought about Roland Vexley somewhere in Denver right now, building his next move with the confidence of a man who'd spent 2 years preparing for this scenario. Then his phone lit up on the table. Decker. He picked it up. Tell me Meridian Group, Decker said. I found the thread. Meridian's been used before, not by Oromont, by a different company. Federal contracting firm in Virginia, 18 months ago. There was an internal whistleblower. The whistleblower had an accident. A pause. The kind of accident that closed the case. Maddox was quiet for a moment. Roland Vexley ran that operation? Vexley wasn't visible. But the same shell company structure was. Same holding firm, different layer of registration. Someone used Meridian on that case, and then someone very carefully removed the connection afterward. I only found it because I know where to look for the specific way they remove things. Decker paused. Maddox. This person, whoever is behind this, has done this before. Possibly more than once. Oromont isn't the first. The kitchen was very quiet. I need a federal contact, Maddox said. Clean, no standard routing. Nobody who can be anticipated. I've already made a call, Decker said. There's an agent, her name is Sandra Voss. Financial Crimes and Corruption Unit. She's been building a case that's been missing a critical piece for 8 months. I think your CEO might be that piece, a pause. But here's the problem. Tell me, the piece she needs isn't the drive alone. She needs something from inside Oromont's own servers, a specific set of procurement records that weren't on any external device, because they were maintained in a protected archive. The kind of thing that can only be accessed from inside the company's own network. Maddox closed his eyes for 2 seconds. So we need to get her inside the building, he said. Afraid so. And right now she's a suspended CEO with frozen accounts who the board has been told is a thief. Decker let that sit for a moment. You see the problem? Yeah, Maddox said. I see it. He hung up. He sat for a moment looking at the window, where the morning light was coming through clean and cold across the snow. He heard Penny laughing at something in the next room, a sudden bright sound, entirely unaware of itself, and then Toby's voice joining in. He thought about Roland's ultimatum. It hadn't been delivered officially yet, but it would be. That was the next move in the pattern, after the narrative, after the account freeze, after the isolation was complete the offer. Give up the drive, go away, and the child is left in peace. He thought about Celeste, sitting at his kitchen table, running the numbers, and not finding a way out. He thought about what Decker had said. This isn't the first time. He was still sitting there when Celeste came back into the kitchen. She looked at his face, and she knew immediately that something had changed. "What happened?" she asked. He told her. He told her everything Decker had said, the prior case, the whistleblower, the missing procurement records, the federal agent named Sandra Voss who'd been building a case with a hole in it for 8 months. He watched her face as he talked. He watched her process each piece. And he watched the point at which she understood what it meant, the specific point, visible in the set of her jaw and the change in her eyes, where the despair he'd seen earlier shifted into something else. Something harder. Something that looked less like a woman who'd been cornered and more like a woman who'd just found the door. "I need to get into Oramont's headquarters," she said. "Yeah, I'm suspended. My access credentials will have been revoked within the first hour." "Yeah. Roland will have people watching the building." She paused. "He'll expect me to run. He's counting on me running. Every move he's made is designed to push me toward flight." She looked at Maddox. "He wouldn't expect me to come back to the building directly." "No," Maddox said. "He wouldn't. I can access the protected archive through a terminal in the server room. There's a physical access protocol, biometric, not network-based, that can't be revoked remotely. It's a contingency I built in when the system was designed." She was already thinking ahead. He could see it. "I'd need 15 minutes at a terminal inside the building. And I'd need to run interference on their security operation while you do it." He held her gaze. "Which means we go together." She looked at him for a moment. Something moved across her face, the particular expression of a person who is not accustomed to having someone volunteer to walk into a difficult situation alongside them, and who isn't entirely sure what to do with it. "You'd be walking into a building where Roland's people know your face," she said. "He's going to underestimate me," Maddox said simply. "They all do. It's the worn jacket." He said it without humor, and she understood he meant it practically. She almost laughed. It came out instead as something shorter and quieter, and she pressed her mouth flat for a moment. "The kids," she said. "Decker will come up. He's 2 hours out. He can be here by noon." He paused. "He's solid. I'd trust him with Toby." And Penny, he agreed. She nodded once. The decision was made, and they both knew it. The way two people in a deteriorating operational situation recognize the point where the analysis is complete and the action has to begin. "We should go tomorrow," she said. "Roland will be expecting me to stay hidden as long as possible. Going quickly is the last thing he'll have planned for." "Tomorrow morning," Maddox said, "before the board gets to their offices." She looked at him steadily across the kitchen table. He looked back at her. They were not friends yet, not entirely. They'd known each other 3 days in a snowstorm with other people's vehicles in the driveway. But there was something between them that had the weight and texture of trust, the specific kind that gets built not by time but by shared pressure. "He's going to call first," she said. "Roland. He'll send the ultimatum before we move. He'll give me the option to hand over the drive in exchange for Penny's safety. Let him. You want him to make the call." "I want him on record making a threat," Maddox said. "I want his voice on tape offering you terms in exchange for evidence." "That's admissible." He paused. "When he calls, keep him talking. Let him say everything he wants to say." She held his gaze. "And what are you going to do while he's talking?" "Make sure we're ready to leave the moment he stops." She nodded. Outside, the snow had finally stopped. The sky over the mountains was the sharp, washed-out blue of a Colorado morning after a storm, the kind of blue that looks too clean to be real, that makes the shadows under the trees look very dark by contrast. From somewhere in the living room came the sound of Toby explaining to Penny, with great seriousness, the difference between sedimentary and igneous rock. Penny was asking questions, real questions, the kind she'd decided the topic deserved. Celeste looked toward the doorway for a moment. Something moved through her expression that was too complicated to name grief and tenderness, and something that looked like resolve, the kind that comes from loving something enough to fight for it, past the point where fighting makes rational sense. She turned back to Maddox. "I've spent 6 years building that company," she said quietly. "I built it from the ground up, 18-hour days, 7 days a week for the first 4 years. I made decisions that cost me my marriage. I made decisions that cost me time with Penny that I'm never getting back. Her voice didn't waver, but something underneath it was very raw. Roland has been inside it for 6 of those years, stealing from it and killing people who found out, and building himself a story where I'm the problem. Maddox said nothing. Sometimes the right thing is to let someone finish. I'm not running, she said. I want to be clear about that. I'm not giving him the drive, I'm not disappearing, and I'm not letting him have what I built. She met his eyes. I need you to know that going in. I'm not brave about this, I'm terrified. But I'm not running. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, I know. 2 words. But he said them the way he said most things, like they'd been weighed first, and whatever they cost, he'd already decided they were worth it. She held his gaze a second longer. Then she picked up her fork and finished her eggs, cold as they were by then, because she was practical even when she was terrified, and because Maddox had been right, you cannot run the math on an empty stomach. Outside the window, the mountains sat white and enormous and indifferent under the clean blue sky, and somewhere in Denver, a man named Roland Vexley was sitting in a very expensive office looking at his phone, waiting for a frightened woman to have run out of options. He had no idea she'd found one. He had even less idea what was coming with her. Roland's call came at 7:43 the following morning. Celeste was standing at the kitchen counter with her second cup of coffee when her phone, the one Maddox had retrieved from Decker's bag, a clean burner purchased the night before, lit up with a number she didn't recognize but immediately understood. She looked at Maddox across the kitchen. He was already moving, pulling out his own phone, opening the recording application they'd set up the previous night, and tested twice to make certain it worked. He gave her a single nod. She answered on the 4th ring. Not the first answering, the first ring tells the caller you've been waiting, and she didn't want Roland to know anything about what she'd been doing. Celeste. His voice was the same as it had always been. That was the thing that hit her first, how completely unchanged it was. Warm, measured, with the particular timbre of a man who'd spent decades making people feel at ease in difficult conversations. She'd sat across a conference table from that voice for 6 years. She'd trusted it. I've been worried about you. She looked at the window. The mountains in the early morning light were pale gold and very still. I'm sure you have, Roland. This whole situation has gotten out of hand. I want you to know that. A pause perfectly timed. The board acted quickly, perhaps too quickly. I've been arguing for a more measured response. I want to resolve this without anyone getting hurt further. That's very kind of you, she said. Maddox was watching her face. She kept her own expression level, kept her voice in the same register she used in board meetings. When someone was presenting numbers she already knew were wrong, and she was letting them finish before she disassembled it. I think if we can speak privately, Roland continued, we can find a path forward that works for everyone. The board's primary concern is the company's stability. My primary concern, and here his voice shifted slightly into something softer, almost paternal, is you and Penny? There it was. What exactly are you proposing, Roland? She said. Simply that we meet. Somewhere neutral. You returned the documentation you took when you left, which I understand you did because you were frightened and not thinking clearly, and I make the case to the board that this was all a misunderstanding. Your accounts are unfrozen, your position is restored, and we move forward. Another pause. The alternative is that this becomes a legal matter, which it doesn't need to be. Nobody wants that, Celeste. Certainly not for Penny's sake. There was the threat, dressed in concern the way a blade gets dressed in cloth. Nobody who heard it could mistake what he meant. He was telling her that the legal route would be ugly and long, and that her daughter would grow up watching her mother's name get dismantled in public. He was telling her that the clean exit for Penny's sake was handing over the drive and accepting his version of events. She looked at Maddox. He was watching her steadily, the phone recording greenlit in his hand, and he made a small gesture with his chin. Keep going. I appreciate your concern for Penny, Celeste said. I really do. Walk me through what this looks like practically. I return the documentation, meaning the encrypted drive, and you advocate with the board for my reinstatement. That's the arrangement. In simple terms, yes. And the financial records I found. The shell companies, the falsified contracts, the payments to Meridian Group for services, rendered those concerns just go away. A silence. Very short. But there. I don't know what you think you found, Roland said, and the warmth in his voice had cooled by a precise degree. But I can tell you that whatever you're describing has an explanation. These things always do. The problem is that removing documents from the company's servers and taking them to wherever you are is not the way to get those explanations. It makes you look guilty of the very things you're accusing others of. Payments to Meridian Group, she said again. Not a question, just repeating it. Letting him hear the name a second time on recording. Celeste, and the procurement records on the federal contracts. The ones you managed personally. The ones that matched the shell company payment structure going back 22 months. She kept her voice completely even. I want to understand your explanation for those, Roland. Because those are federal contracts, which makes the irregularities in those records a different category of problem from the Oromont internal fraud. This silence was longer. When he spoke again, the warmth was entirely gone. The voice underneath it was something she'd never heard from him directly before. Though she recognized it, the voice of a man who has decided that the conversation has moved past negotiation. You're making a serious mistake, he said. I've made them before, she said. Trusting you was the biggest one. I want you to know I said that clearly on this call, so there's no ambiguity later about what I understood. She paused. Goodbye, Roland. She ended the call. Her hand was not entirely steady when she set the phone on the counter. She pressed both palms flat against the countertop for a moment and breathed. You did that perfectly, Maddox said. I did that terrified, she said, which isn't the same thing. Sometimes it is. He held up his phone. The recording was clean, 4 minutes and 17 seconds of Roland Vexley, explicitly referencing the encrypted drive, Meridian Group, the reinstatement offer, and the implicit threat about Penny delivered in language that a federal prosecutor could work with for a month. Decker's contact gets this in the next 10 minutes. Agent Voss will have it before 9. Celeste straightened up from the counter. Down the hall, she could hear Penny's voice and Toby's voice tangled together, arguing cheerfully about something, whether a specific rock qualified as having sparkles or just being shiny, which was apparently a distinction that mattered enormously to both of them. Decker was in the living room. She'd met him the night before, a lean, quiet man in his 40s, with the self-contained quality of someone who has spent years in rooms where saying the wrong thing had actual consequences. He'd looked at Penny for approximately 4 seconds, and then gone and sat on the floor next to her rock collection, and asked which one was the best one, which had immediately made him Penny's second favorite person in the house after Toby. Celeste listened to her daughter argue about rocks with a child she'd known for 4 days, and felt the particular pain of a mother who is about to walk away from her child towards something dangerous and is trying to find the part of herself that can do it without falling apart. She'll be fine, Maddox said quietly. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the counter, giving her the privacy of not being watched. Decker's the best babysitter I've ever trusted, which I mean as a serious operational assessment, not a compliment. She almost laughed. Is that how you evaluate babysitters? It's the only metric I've ever found that's reliable. She took one more breath. Then she picked up her jacket and put it on. Let's go. They took Maddox's truck. Not because it was inconspicuous. A 14-year-old Ford with a dented rear quarter panel and a crack in the passenger side mirror was conspicuous in the underground parking structure of a Denver high-rise in an entirely different way than Roland's people would be looking for, but because it was registered to a private individual with no corporate connection, and because it started reliable in the cold, and because Maddox had driven it long enough to trust it the way you trust a tool you've used, past the point where it surprises you. The drive down from Silver Pines took 2 hours on roads that had been partially cleared overnight, but still had enough ice on the shaded bends to require full attention. Maddox drove, and Celeste sat in the passenger seat with her phone, running through everything she knew about the server room's physical access protocol and what she'd need to do once she was inside. They didn't talk much for the first hour. The silence between them had changed since the farmhouse had had the different quality of two people who've spent enough compressed time together that quiet no longer requires management. She watched the mountains pull back and the highway open up and thought about the last time she'd driven this road toward Denver. 3 days ago. Before the mountains, before the crash, before all of it. She'd been running through the evidence framework in her head, planning the approach to investigators, feeling the particular controlled fear of someone about to do something irreversible and necessary. She was still afraid, but something about it felt different now. Can I ask you something? She said. Yeah, your wife. She paused. I'm sorry, you don't have to. It's okay. What do you want to know? She looked at the road. How long? 4 years ago. She'd been sick for 2. He said it the way he said most things measured, factual, no performance of grief, but not without it either. Toby was 4 when she died. I'm sorry, yeah, he was quiet for a moment. She was the one who was good at all of it. The ordinary stuff. The school things, the braid things, the knowing what to say when a kid woke up from a nightmare. He glanced at the road ahead. I was good at the operational end, making sure the house was secure, the bills were paid, the systems worked. The rest of it I've been figuring out one day at a time for 4 years. Toby seems a good kid. He got that from her. He paused. Most days I think I'm probably doing it wrong in about 8 different ways. But he's fed and he's kind and he finds things interesting, which is the most I know how to aim for. She looked at his profile for a moment. That's not nothing, she said. Finding things interesting. In a kid that age, that's actually quite difficult to produce. He produced it himself. He came out that way. You kept the conditions for it. That's not nothing either. He glanced at her briefly. Said nothing. But she saw something shift in his jaw, some small acknowledgement that landed differently than he'd expected. They drove. The city appeared on the horizon as a low gray gathering beneath the winter sky, and Celeste watched it come toward them and tried to remember the last time Denver had looked to her the way it looked right now, not like a destination, but like a place where something was being decided. Oromont Technologies occupied the top 6 floors of a glass tower in the downtown financial district. Celeste had chosen the building herself when the company outgrew its original space. She'd wanted the top floors because she liked the sight lines. The way you could see the mountains from the executive level on a clear day. And remember, there was something larger than the quarterly projections. She'd thought about that choice a lot in the past 3 days, lying in various places she hadn't expected to be lying, wondering if the person who'd made that choice about sight lines was the same person she currently was. They parked 2 blocks away, walking distance, out of camera range of the building's exterior system. Tell me the layout from the parking level, Maddox said. She did. She'd been through it the night before with Decker while they planned. But Maddox was the kind of person who wanted to hear things directly rather than through relay, and she understood why you hear different details when someone is explaining to you versus to a room. The server room was on the 41st floor, 2 floors below the executive level. Access was biometric palm scan backed up by a 6-digit code that changed weekly and that Celeste generated personally. The remote revocation of her credentials had almost certainly pulled her network access, her keycard access, and her system login. It had not and could not pull the biometric protocol, which ran on a separate physical system she'd insisted on installing as a board member failsafe after a prior company she knew had lost access to critical records during an executive transition dispute. She'd been very clear in the specifications. Biometric access to the physical server archive had to be independent of all network-based access control. Roland knew she was thorough. He might have thought of this. If he had, there would be someone in the server room, or at the server room door, or at the 41st floor access point. If someone's there, Maddox asked. I need 3 minutes once I'm at a terminal. 5 to be safe. I'll handle the someone. He said it the same way he said everything that was operationally definitive, without emphasis, without drama, as a simple statement of what was going to happen. She'd noticed that about him. The absence of performance around difficult things. He didn't make scenes of resolve, he just resolved. The board meeting, she said. It starts at 9:30. That's in, she checked. 40 minutes. Then we need to be inside in 20, he said. They got out of the truck. The lobby of Oromont Technologies had a particular quality of engineered calm marble floors, clean lines, the low ambient sound of a building that had been designed to communicate stability and permanence. The security desk was staffed by 2 people Celeste had seen dozens of times. She knew their names. She'd remembered a birthday once and a new baby. These were not things that would help her now. Maddox walked in first. She watched him enter from just outside the glass doors, standing to the side where she could see the lobby without being immediately visible, and she watched the security desk's reaction to him. Watched them look at the worn jacket, the unremarkable face, the way he moved without any of the markers that made the lobby's usual traffic identifiable, the expensive briefcase, the confident stride of someone who knows they belong somewhere. They assessed him and relaxed. Not consciously just the small physical adjustment of people who have decided someone is not a relevant variable. He approached the desk. She couldn't hear what he said, but she could see the body language of the exchange, unhurried, conversational, the guard leaning slightly forward with the posture of someone who's helping with a mild confusion rather than managing a situation. He was buying her 90 seconds. She moved through the lobby toward the service corridor on the south side, the one she'd used 100 times during the building's renovation 3 years ago because it took 2 minutes off the walk to the freight elevator. The corridor was empty. The freight elevator was on basement level. She took it to 41. The server room door was unguarded. She almost faltered at that, almost let herself believe. Roland hadn't thought of this, that she'd gotten the one angle he'd missed, and then she pressed her palm to the reader and entered her code, and the door opened, and she understood immediately that he had thought of it. The man inside was sitting at the terminal she needed. He was not a Meridian type, not the physical enforcement category. He was younger, wearing a shirt and tie, the kind of person you'd describe as nondescript if you were being generous, and forgettable if you were being accurate. A technical person. Someone Roland had placed here to occupy the terminal and wait. He looked up when she walked in. His hand moved toward his phone on the desk. "Don't," Celeste said. He looked at her hand. She was not holding anything she had nothing to hold. She was a 5'6" woman in a borrowed jacket who had just walked into a room telling him not to reach for his phone, with nothing backing that instruction except the quality of her voice. She'd used that voice in board meetings. She'd used it with investors who came in planning to tell her that her vision was too ambitious. She'd learned it from necessity, the way you learn anything you need badly enough by using it until it worked. He hesitated. "Get up," she said. Move to the left side of the room. "I need 3 minutes at that terminal, and then I will leave, and you can do whatever you need to do. You can tell Roland you couldn't stop me. That will be true." He was staring at her. She could see him calculating who she was, what she was willing to do, what his instructions had been, and whether they covered this specific scenario. "He didn't tell you. I might come here personally, did he?" she said. Not a question. The man's expression shifted. That was enough of an answer. "He told you to wait in case I tried to access the system remotely," she said. "He didn't think I'd walk back in." She held his gaze. "Get up." He got up. He moved to the left side of the room, watching her with the expression of someone who has decided their personal risk assessment has shifted and is recalculating in real time. She sat at the terminal and began. The biometric protocol let her into the physical archive without asking for network credentials. The archive was structured the way she'd built it hierarchically, with the procurement records maintained as a separate vault within the system, accessible only from this terminal and requiring a secondary authentication that was not biometric but memory-based, a passphrase she had never written down and had never told anyone. She typed it, and the vault opened. The procurement records for the federal contracts were there. All of them, including the version history that showed what had been altered, when and by which user account. Roland had been careful about the surface documentation. The final filed versions were clean. But the version history in the physical archive showed every edit, every manipulation. 22 months of it, each change logged with a timestamp and an account identifier that traced directly to Roland's administrative credentials. She pulled it to the encrypted drive. The transfer took 1 minute 40 seconds. She watched the progress bar move and counted her own breathing, and did not allow herself to think about anything else. The door behind her opened. She did not turn around immediately. She waited for the transfer to complete 4 more seconds, and then she pulled the drive and stood and turned. It was Roland. Not Harlan Cross, not the nondescript man in the tie Roland himself, which meant he'd been in the building, which meant he'd anticipated something she hadn't fully anticipated, and she felt the cold specificity of that realization move through her. He looked exactly the same as he always had. 61 years old, silver-haired, the kind of handsome that comes from a lifetime of good suits and confident posture. He was looking at her with an expression she'd never seen on him before, not angry, not afraid. Something beyond both. Something that recognized the conversation was over and had already moved past it to whatever came next. "Celeste," he said, calm, completely calm. "Roland." He looked at the drive in her hand, then at the terminal behind her, then back at her face. She watched him run the calculation, what she'd accessed, what she'd taken, whether there was still a version of this where he contained it. "You know this doesn't end well for you," he said. "Whatever you think you have. Version history on the federal procurement records," she said. "Your administrative credentials on every altered filing going back 22 months. Timestamp logs, account identifiers, all of it physically archived and now physically in my hand." She held up the drive. "This goes to Agent Sandra Voss, Financial Crimes and Corruption Unit, within the hour, along with a recorded phone call from this morning in which you explicitly offered to make evidence of federal contract fraud disappear in exchange for my cooperation." She kept her voice level. "You're not containing this, Roland. It's already out." Something moved through his face then, fast there and gone. She'd expected rage or denial or the continued performance of calm. What she saw instead was something that surprised her, a kind of recognition. A man who'd been running very fast for a very long time and had just heard the sound of the road ending. He reached into his jacket. I wouldn't. The voice came from behind Roland. Maddox stepped through the server room door. He'd come through the maintenance stairwell on the south side. She knew that without asking, could reconstruct it from the geometry. He was not holding anything. He didn't need to be. He was standing in the doorway with the particular quality of stillness that she had first noticed in his farmhouse kitchen 2 days ago, and had since come to understand was not calm, but something more functional than calm. It was the physical posture of a man who has already decided what he will do and is simply waiting for the requirement to arrive. Roland looked at him, took in the worn jacket, the unassuming face, the nondescript build that held nothing theatrical and nothing soft. Who are you? Roland said. Nobody important, Maddox said. Just her mechanic. Her Roland's composure cracked slightly at the edges. Not much, but it was visible. He looked from Maddox to Celeste and back, and she could see him recalibrating. This was not what he'd prepared for. He'd prepared for a frightened woman making a desperate move alone. He had not prepared for the specific combination of what was in that room. You drove up here to help her, Roland said to Maddox. The contempt was there, but thinner now, a covering layer over something less certain. You understand what she's accusing me of? You understand the kind of people who are involved in this? Yeah, Maddox said. I spent last night on the phone with some of them, the federal kind. He glanced at the man in the tie, who was still standing against the left wall, with the frozen expression of someone who has decided the best strategy is complete neutrality. You should probably sit down, he told the man. The man sat down. Roland moved. Not toward the door, he was already between the door and Maddox, but toward the terminal. Some calculation about destroying something, resetting something, any action that created delay. Maddox stepped left and closed the angle before Roland had covered 3 feet, and Roland stopped. Think carefully, Maddox said. Quiet, even. You can make this a physical situation if you want to. I'll tell you right now, clearly, that you don't want to do that. Not because of what I might do, I'm not going to hurt you. Because of what it looks like when the agents come through that door in about 10 minutes and find you in an escalated physical confrontation with a suspended CEO you've been trying to threaten into silence. He paused. You've been smart for 22 months, be smart for 10 more minutes. Roland Vexley was 61 years old and had spent his career in boardrooms and behind financial architecture that kept his hands technically clean. He was not a man built for physical confrontation, and he knew it, and Maddox had just said so in the most precise and non-threatening way possible, which made it somehow worse than a threat. He stood very still. Sit down, Roland, Celeste said. It's over. He looked at her. For a long moment, the server room was completely silent, except for the soft mechanical sound of the archive systems cycling through their maintenance operations, indifferent to everything happening in the room. Then Roland sat down. Agent Sandra Voss arrived at 9:47 with 2 colleagues and credentials that made the building's lobby security step back without argument. She was a compact woman in her late 40s with close-cropped gray hair and the expression of someone who has spent enough years looking at financial crimes to find them ugly in a way that hadn't dulled with familiarity. She'd spoken to Decker. She'd received the recording. She'd reviewed enough of the preliminary documentation that when she walked into the server room and found Roland Vexley sitting in a chair and Celeste Hawkridge standing across from him with a drive in her hand and a former Navy SEAL leaning against the doorframe with the demeanor of someone waiting for a bus, she had enough context to not need it explained. She looked at Maddox. Decker speaks very highly of you, she said. Decker speaks very moderately of everyone, Maddox said. Highly is unusual, that's why I said it. She looked at Roland. Mr. Vexley, I've been looking for the other end of something for 8 months. I think you're it. She nodded to one of her colleagues. Please read him his rights. Roland said nothing during the reading. He sat with his hands flat on his thighs and his jaw set, and his eyes somewhere in the middle distance, and Celeste watched him and felt something she hadn't expected to feel, not triumph, not relief, something older and less satisfying. The particular exhaustion of being right about something you desperately wished you'd been wrong about. She looked away. Maddox was watching her. When she met his eyes, he didn't ask anything, didn't offer a sentiment. Just looked at her steadily, in the way she'd come to understand meant, I'm here, and you don't have to manage this for me. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked at Agent Voss. I have everything you need. The procurement records, the version history, the shell company documentation, and the recordings. Where do you want to start? Start with the federal contracting records, Boss said. We can move to the Ormont internal material from there. She glanced at Celeste with the expression of someone who respects competence specifically when it shows up in difficult circumstances. You built a strong case, Ms. Hawkridge. The fact that you came back in person to get the final piece when you could have run that matters. I built a company, Celeste said. I wasn't going to let him have it. The board convened an emergency session at 11. 3 members resigned before the meeting was formally called to order, apparently having received legal advice that the distance between themselves and Roland Vexley needed to become immediately and documentably large. 2 others remained who Celeste had assessed correctly, people who had been managed rather than complicit, who had believed Roland's version of events because he'd delivered it convincingly and early, and they hadn't had access to the counter-argument. She walked into the boardroom and the temperature of the room changed. Maddox was not in the room. He was in the corridor outside, which was where he'd positioned himself, without being asked, visible through the glass wall, leaning against the corridor railing with his arms crossed and his back to her, looking out at the city. Not in the room where she was presenting her case. Not making it about himself. Just there, in the way that presence can mean something without requiring explanation. She presented for 40 minutes. She did not perform, she documented. She walked through the procurement records, the shell company structures, the payment logs, the Meridian Group connections, and the recording from that morning. She was thorough without being aggressive. She'd built cases before, on the other side of the table, convincing of boards of things they didn't want to be convinced of. She knew how this worked. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then Gerald Marsh, the longest-serving board member, who was 74 years old, and had been investing in companies since before Celeste was born, said, "What do you need from us right now?" "My reinstatement," she said. "Access restored, suspension lifted, public statement clarifying that the allegations were based on fabricated evidence produced by Roland Vexley to protect himself." She paused. "And a commitment from this board that the culture that allowed a CFO to operate a parallel criminal infrastructure for nearly 2 years without oversight is not something we accept and move past. We fix it. Structurally. Not cosmetically. That's a longer conversation," Marsh said. "I know. I'm starting it now." She looked around the table. Anyone opposed to the reinstatement? No one was opposed to the reinstatement. Maddox was still in the corridor when she came out. He looked at her once and read her face the way he'd been reading it for days directly, practically, going past the expression to what was underneath it. "They reinstated you," he said. "Yes. That's good. It is." She stood beside him at the railing and looked out at the city. The mountains were visible from here, clean white, against the winter blue, the same mountains they'd driven down from that morning. "They also offered you a position," she said. "Head of executive security. Full salary, benefits, office in the building. I told them I would ask. I figured you would." And he was quiet for a moment. Not thinking about it, she had the sense he'd already thought about it, probably had since, before they drove down. "No." She nodded slowly. She'd expected that. She was surprised to find that some part of her had also hoped for the opposite, and she noted that particular internal contradiction without doing much with it. "Toby," she said. "Toby," he agreed. "He's got a thing going at that school in Silver Pines. Friends, a teacher he likes. Rocks that need cataloging." He almost smiled. "If I take a job in Denver, I'm commuting 2 hours or moving him. Both of those are decisions made for my situation, not his." She stopped. Started again. Most people wouldn't frame it that way. Most people aren't raising an 8-year-old alone. He glanced at her sideways. "You framed it that way for Penny once. About the company." "I was listening." She looked at him. "When?" "This morning. Before the call. You were telling her that Mama had something important to do, and it wouldn't take long, and then they'd figure out the next thing together." He held her gaze. "You said the next thing? Not my schedule. That's a different framework." She hadn't noticed he'd heard that. "She's been raising me as much as I've been raising her," Celeste said quietly. "That's the thing nobody tells you about doing it alone. The kid becomes your compass whether you intend it or not." Maddox looked out at the mountains. "Yeah," he said. "That's exactly right." They stood there a moment, side by side at the railing, with the city below them and the mountains beyond it, and the particular quiet of 2 people who have just been through something difficult together and are standing still for the first time since it started. "You drove 2 hours to back me up in a server room when you could have stayed on your farm and been completely uninvolved," she said. "You were in my house," he said. Stop being uninvolved when that happened. Maddox. He looked at her. Thank you. She said it the way she meant it, plain, direct, without softening or elaboration. The way she'd learned that the things that mattered most deserved to be said. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked back at the mountains. Decker's going to need feeding when we get back, he said. He eats a lot for someone that thin. She laughed. The laugh surprised her, real, sudden, the kind that arrived before she could decide anything about it. She pressed her fingers to her mouth for a second. Let's go home, she said. The word came out before she'd considered it. Home. She'd meant Silver Pines, the farmhouse, the narrow bedroom with the tilted lampshade, and the water stain on the ceiling. She'd meant the place they'd left that morning, with Penny and Toby still arguing about rocks. She waited to feel strange about having said it. She didn't. Maddox pushed off the railing and straightened his jacket, the worn one. The one Roland's security detail had dismissed on sight. The one he'd been wearing when he'd stepped through a server room door at exactly the right moment and said nothing, more threatening than think carefully, and made a man with 22 months of criminal. Infrastructure sit down without laying a hand on him. Yeah, he said. Let's go. They walked toward the elevator together, and neither of them said anything else. The city went on below them, entirely indifferent to what had just happened, which was always how cities were, Celeste had learned, about the things that mattered most to the specific people inside them. The elevator doors closed. In the corridor behind them, through the glass wall of the boardroom, Gerald Marsh was already on the phone, beginning the process of repairing what had been broken, which was the way these things always went. Slow and unglamorous, one phone call at a time. And somewhere in Denver, in a federal building that didn't have Oramont's view of the mountains, Roland Vexley's was sitting in a room answering questions that were going to take a long time to finish, because the thread Decker had found had two more ends that nobody had pulled yet, and Agent Sandra Voss was the kind of person who pulled every end until there was nothing left to find. The truck was where they'd left it, 2 blocks away. The dented quarter panel and the cracked mirror, exactly where they'd been that morning. Maddox unlocked it and got in. Celeste got in on the passenger side and pulled the door shut, and the cab filled immediately with the smell of old upholstery and the faint diesel warmth of the heater working its way up. He started the engine. She looked out the windshield at the winter street, at the ordinary Tuesday morning of a city going about its business, and thought about a farmhouse 2 hours away, where her daughter was probably showing Decker exactly which rock was Gerald and which rocks were Gerald's supporting cast. She thought about what came next, the weeks of investigation, the board restructuring, the company that needed rebuilding from the inside out, the work that would be harder than any quarter she'd survived because it was the internal kind, the kind where the failures were human rather than financial. She thought about a narrow bedroom and a tilted lampshade, and the particular silence of a house that had been lonely for a long time, before it wasn't anymore. Maddox, she said. Yeah, I'm going to need to think about some things. Going forward. I know, he said. He put the truck in gear and pulled out into the street, and the mountains appeared in the windshield ahead of them as they turned west, white and enormous and patient in the winter sky, the way they always were, waiting for whatever came down off them and whatever came back. The drive back to Silver Pines took longer than the drive down. Not because of traffic or road conditions, the highway was clear, the afternoon light flat, and even across the snow-covered fields on either side, but because somewhere around the 40-minute mark, Celeste fell asleep in the passenger's seat. Not gradually, not the slow negotiated process of a person trying to rest. She just went. 1 minute she was looking out the windshield at the mountains, and the next her head was against the window, and her breathing had changed, and she was completely, utterly gone. Maddox noticed and said nothing and drove. He'd seen exhaustion like that before, the kind that waits behind the adrenaline and the focus and the necessity of the moment. That stands politely aside until the necessity is finished and then arrives all at once, non-negotiable. He'd felt it himself, more times than he could count, in places that had required everything he had and then asked for a little more on top. She slept for an hour and 12 minutes. He knew because he checked the clock when she went under and checked it again when she woke, not from any particular reason, just the habit of tracking things that mattered. She woke with a small startled sound and then was immediately, completely alert, in the way of someone who had trained herself not to surface slowly. She looked at the road, then at the mountains, then at him. How long, she said, little over an hour. She pressed her hand against her face briefly. I'm sorry. Don't be. I don't usually, Celeste. He kept his eyes on the road. You haven't slept more than 3 hours at a stretch in 4 days. You were in a car crash. You hid in a basement while 6 men circled your location. You walked back into a building where someone had active enforcement in place, and you presented a 40-minute board case of this morning. He paused. Sleeping in a truck is not a character flaw. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You sound like you've given that speech before." Different version of it. To myself, mostly. He glanced at her briefly. Took me about 2 years to figure out that running past your limit isn't the same thing as being strong. She looked at him. He had the sense she was thinking about something more than what he'd just said, using it as a door into a different room. "Is that what you were doing? After your wife?" "Partly." He turned his eyes back to the road. "Mostly I was just trying to get through days without Toby noticing how bad it was. Which he noticed anyway, because he's 8 and he's not stupid. He just decided not to say anything about it, which is its own kind of terrible. Did he ever say anything eventually, about 6 months in? He asked me if I was going to be sad forever." Maddox was quiet for a second. I told him I didn't know. He thought about it for a while, and then he said okay and went back to whatever he was doing. Another pause. I think he needed the honest answer more than the reassuring one. "Yes," Celeste said softly. "They usually do." The mountains were closer now, the highway starting its long lean upward toward the elevation, where Silver Pines sat in its pocket of valley between 2 ridges. The light was starting to go amber at the edges, the particular gold of late Colorado afternoon in winter. "Penny asked me once," Celeste said, "why Daddy didn't live with us. She was 3.5. I gave her the age-appropriate version that Mama and Daddy loved her very much, but were better at being her parents when they weren't living in the same house." She looked at the mountains. She thought about it for a minute and then said, "But who makes Daddy's bed?" She wasn't concerned about the relationship. She was concerned about whether her father had adequate domestic support. Maddox made a sound that was close to a laugh. "I didn't know whether to be relieved or worried," Celeste said. "I ended up being both." She was quiet for a moment. "Her father is in Seattle now. He's remarried, has 2 stepchildren, calls Penny on her birthday, and occasionally in between. She has adapted to this with a pragmatism that I find both admirable and slightly heartbreaking." She paused. She's never had what she has right now. In that farmhouse. With Toby showing her rocks and someone cooking dinner at a normal hour, and the sense that the house itself is solid, that it holds. She stopped. Maddox didn't fill the silence. He let it sit where she'd put it and drove. "I've been thinking about what I said," she finally continued. "This morning. When I said, 'let's go home,' and I meant your farmhouse. I heard you say it. I know you did." She looked at him. "I didn't feel strange about it. And I've been trying to figure out what that means. Whether it's just the adrenaline, or the situation, or whether she stopped." Shook her head slightly. "I'm not good at this." "At what?" "At this." She gestured vaguely at the space between them. "At saying things that aren't operational. At having a conversation where I don't know what the outcome is supposed to be." He was quiet for a moment. "Most of the conversations worth having are the ones where you don't know that going in." That sounds like something a person says who's made peace with uncertainty. "I haven't made peace with anything," he said. "I just got tired of treating uncertainty like a problem to solve." She looked at him for a long moment. "I don't know what I'm saying," she said honestly. I'm not trying to say something that isn't there. She pressed her mouth flat. "I haven't wanted to go home to a place in a very long time. I've gone home to an apartment that has good security and a good view, and Penny's room that I decorated very carefully, and a kitchen I mostly use to make her breakfast. But I haven't wanted to." She looked out the window. "I wanted to go back to your farmhouse. I just wanted to tell you that, because it seemed like something worth saying." Maddox drove for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "Yeah, it's worth saying. Nothing more than that." But he said it the way he said the things that counted, with the weight of having actually heard what she meant rather than what she'd technically said. The truck turned onto the county road that led north toward Silver Pines, and the mountains closed in around them, tall and snow-covered and indifferent in the way that mountains are to the small human dramas taking place in the valley below them. The farmhouse lights appeared in the distance, amber and warm against the early dark, and Celeste felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't fully known was tight. Penny launched herself at Celeste from approximately 6 feet away, and with a velocity that Celeste was only barely prepared for, catching her daughter and absorbing the impact, and going down to one knee on the porch, while Penny wrapped both arms around her neck and both legs around her waist, and pressed her face hard against her mother's shoulder. "You were gone all day," Penny said, not accusing. just reporting the facts as she had experienced them. I know, baby, I'm sorry. Toby and I named 3 more rocks. You have to see them. I will absolutely see them. Gerald has a family now. Decker helped. Celeste looked over Penny's shoulder at Decker, who was standing in the doorway with the carefully neutral expression of a man who has been fully drafted into a rock naming ceremony and has chosen to accept this about himself. He raised one hand in a small acknowledgement of the situation. Maddox was looking at Decker with the expression of a man whose day had given him very little room for amusement and had just found some. You named rocks, Maddox said. Gerald needed a support structure, Decker said. It was either that or listen to a 6-year-old be sad about a rock being alone. I made a judgment call. How many? Gerald now has a wife, 2 children, and what Penny describes as a complicated aunt. She's a piece of rose quartz. A pause. The aunt, not Penny. Toby appeared in the doorway behind Decker. He looked at his father, then at Celeste and Penny on the porch, and did the rapid emotional inventory that children do, checking the room's temperature, assessing what version of the returning adults he was looking at. He must have concluded something good because his face relaxed into the ordinary expression he wore when he wasn't bracing for anything. Is it done? He asked. Maddox climbed the porch steps. Yeah, bud, it's done. Toby nodded once. Then I'm hungry. When are you not hungry? Basically never, Toby said, with the calm self-knowledge of someone who has long since accepted this about himself. Maddox put his hand briefly on top of Toby's head as he passed through the door, not a dramatic gesture, just a point of contact, the kind fathers make with children when they've been away and come back and want to confirm without making a scene of it that the important things are in the same place they left them. Celeste saw it and felt it in some part of herself that she kept quiet about. Dinner that night was louder than any meal in that farmhouse had probably been in years. Decker turned out to be unexpectedly useful in the kitchen, not skilled, exactly, but competent in the particular way of someone who has spent time in locations where cooking adequately was a survival skill rather than an aesthetics choice. He and Maddox worked around each other without discussion, which Celeste watched with the fascination of someone observing 2 people who'd operated in the same professional world long enough to share a kind of physical shorthand. Penny and Toby sat at the kitchen table and drew a map of Gerald's family's house, which appeared to be a detailed architectural rendering of a rock formation they'd built in the living room. The aunt, the rose quartz, occupied a corner position that Penny described as having good light. Toby accepted this assessment without argument. Celeste set the table. She hadn't set a table for other people, not as a domestic act, not the way this was in years. Her apartment in Denver had a dining table she used for documents. She ate most meals at her desk or standing at the kitchen counter while answering emails, or at restaurants where someone else cleared everything away. She folded napkins and put out plates and found she was doing it carefully, paying attention to it, and didn't immediately know why. It was just dinner, just a farmhouse kitchen in Colorado with mismatched chairs and a crack in the ceiling above the refrigerator and a stack of Toby's library books on one end of the counter. It was completely ordinary. She thought, I have a penthouse apartment in Denver with a view that architects put in a portfolio, and I cannot explain why this is better. But she knew why. She just wasn't ready to say it plainly yet, even to herself. The federal investigation moved the way federal investigations move, steadily, methodically, and without the dramatic velocity of a single afternoon in a boardroom. Over the weeks that followed, Agent Voss and her team built the full picture of Roland Vexley's operation, which turned out to be, as Decker had suspected, considerably larger than one company's CFO making bad choices. Roland had run variations of the same scheme at 2 other companies before Ormont. The previous case the whistleblower Decker had found in the incident report had been closed after the whistleblower's accident, which investigation now determined had not been an accident. Marcus, Celeste's replacement driver, was found in Phoenix 3 weeks after the crash. He cooperated with investigators in exchange for consideration. His testimony established that the crash had been intended as a fatal incident and that he had lost his nerve at the last moment when the vehicle went into the ditch at a different angle than planned. The chain of instructions traced back through 2 intermediaries to Roland directly. Roland was charged on 11 federal counts. His attorney immediately began the paperwork for a plea negotiation, which Voss accepted on the condition that Roland provided full disclosure on the network of shell companies and the other cases. He did. The disclosure opened 3 additional investigations in 2 other states. Celeste attended none of the proceedings personally. Voss kept her informed, and she read the reports and gave depositions where required. But she had already decided that watching Roland answer for it was not something she needed. She'd needed the company back, and the record corrected, and the people he'd hurt protected. The rest of it was the justice system's business, and she had enough respect for her own time and her own peace of mind to leave it there. Ormont took most of her attention in those first weeks. The structural repair was harder than the legal battle, because it was interior work examining the culture, the oversight failures, the places where Roland's careful management of information had created blind spots that nobody had questioned because he was Roland, because he'd been there 6 years, because the company was doing well on paper, and when things are going well on paper, people stop asking about what's underneath. She brought in an outside audit firm. She restructured the Financial Oversight Committee. She personally interviewed every member of the procurement team and then sat with what she'd learned for 2 days before deciding what it meant for the people and the processes. She made decisions she wasn't proud of, had to let 2 people go who hadn't been complicit in the fraud, but who had been incurious in ways that had made the fraud easier, and she was honest with herself about the fact that those decisions cost her sleep. She also changed her own schedule. Not dramatically. Not all at once. She'd been running this company for years on a particular rhythm, and you don't rebuild a rhythm overnight without breaking something. But she started leaving the office at 6 instead of 9. She hired a deputy operations lead who was, she assessed honestly, better at 3 specific things than she was, and she let him be better at those things without managing him into doing them her way. And she started driving to Silver Pines on weekends. The first time she drove up, 3 weeks after the board meeting, she told herself it was to check on Penny's adjustment. Penny had been staying in Denver during the week for school, but Celeste had noticed that her daughter had developed what could only be described as a Toby-shaped gap in her emotional landscape. She talked about Toby at dinner. She talked about Gerald the Rock. She had placed Gerald and his complicated rose quartz aunt on her bedroom windowsill and spoke to them on mornings when she thought Celeste wasn't listening. Celeste drove to Silver Pines, and Penny and Toby immediately disappeared into Toby's room to conduct what was described as urgent geological business, and Celeste found herself sitting at Maddox Granger's kitchen table with a cup of coffee watching snow fall through the window, while Maddox fixed the slow drain that had apparently not gotten any better since October. "You're still working on that drain," she said. "It's a process." His voice came from under the sink. "You fixed a car engine in your driveway last week, I assume." 2, actually. A pause. "The drain it's a different relationship." She looked at the window. The snow was coming down light and clean, the good kind. "Penny has your son's rock on her windowsill," she said. "Gerald. She talks to him in the mornings." A pause under the sink. "Does she?" In full sentences. "She gives him news updates." Celeste wrapped both hands around her mug. "She's never had a friend she missed like that. I didn't know she could miss people like that yet. Toby asked me twice when Penny was coming back," Maddox said. "That's unusual for him. He doesn't usually ask about things directly. He waits and sees. Penny doesn't wait. She asks and then asks again in case you didn't hear."
"Yeah."
Something shifted under the sink, a wrench being repositioned. "They're good for each other that way." "Opposites," Celeste agreed. "Most good things are." She looked at the window again. Then she said, "Without having planned to, I changed my schedule. I'm leaving the office at 6 now." A pause. "How's that going?" "Strange. I keep having the sensation that I've forgotten something. Like I'm leaving early because I missed something critical." She turned her mug in her hands. "But I'm not. I checked. I'm actually just leaving." "Does it feel better?" "Ask me in 6 months," she paused. "My deputy operations lead reorganized the Friday reporting structure while I wasn't there to have opinions about it. It's objectively better than my version." That was unpleasant to acknowledge. "But you acknowledged it. I'm acknowledging it to you right now." "That's about as far as I've gotten." He came out from under the sink, sat back against the cabinet, hands on his knees, looked at her across the kitchen. There was plumber's putty on his left forearm, and his hair was doing something unreasonable from being upside down, and he was looking at her with that particular directness that she'd come to understand was just how he looked at things without. The social lubricant of looking slightly past them. "You came up this weekend," he said. "Not for the first time." "No," she said. "Not for the first time. Are we going to talk about that?" She met his eyes. "I think we probably should." He waited. I'm not confused about what I'm doing," she said carefully. "I'm not running from Denver or from the company or from anything. I've been thinking about this clearly and I know what it is." She paused. But I also know that I have a 6-year-old who is already emotionally invested in the person sitting under that sink, and a company that is in the middle of a structural rebuilding that requires me to be present and sharp. And I haven't done this well before. Any of it. The last time I tried to balance this specific combination of things, it cost me a marriage. She looked at him steadily. So I'm being careful. Not because I'm unsure, because I'm taking it seriously. Maddox was quiet for a long moment. I have a kid too, he said. And 3 years of being careful about everything inside a 20-mile radius, because careful felt the same as safe. He paused. It's not the same thing. No, she said, it's not. For what it's worth, he said, I'm not asking you to be less careful. I'm just telling you I know what you're doing up here, and I think you know what I think about it. She looked at him. Say it plainly. You're welcome here, he said. Both of you. That's all. It was such a simple thing. She'd been offered apartments, security details, company cars, quarterly bonuses, a board seat on 2 other companies that wanted her name on their letterhead. Nobody had offered her welcome in a long time. Not the kind that meant the door opens when you show up, and nobody requires you to justify the fact of your presence. She felt it land somewhere specific. Okay, she said. Okay, he agreed. He stood up and went to wash the putty off his arm, and she turned back to the window. And outside the snow kept coming down soft and indifferent, covering everything at the same rate, the farmhouse and the barn and the mountain road and the distant ridge, making the whole world look clean and temporary and ready to be something different by morning. That was in January. By March, Penny was spending every other weekend in Silver Pines, which had evolved from Celeste's driving her up and staying to Celeste driving her up and staying, because it had not once occurred to anyone to suggest an alternative arrangement. Toby had cleared space on his bookshelf for a dedicated geology section that was mostly Penny's research, printed from the library computer and annotated in her large, careful handwriting. By May, Penny was asking if she could go to school in Silver Pines. Celeste had not seen that coming. She sat with the question for 3 days, turning it over, checking her own reaction, for the parts that were legitimate concern versus the parts that were about her own discomfort with how much the landscape of her life had shifted in 4 months. Then she drove to Silver Pines on a Tuesday, not a weekend, a Tuesday, and found Maddox in the barn replacing a belt on an old tractor and told him what Penny had asked. He stopped what he was doing, looked at her. What do you want to do? I want to know if it's possible, she said, before I decide what I want. Silver Pines has a good school. Toby's teacher is she's really good with kids who think in specific ways. Penny, he paused. Yeah, it would work for her. And you, Celeste said. Is that something you're asking if I want you closer, he said. She held his gaze. Yes. Yeah, he said. I want you closer. He said it the same way he said everything that was true, without decoration, without walking it back. I've wanted that for a while. I just figured you'd get there in your own time, or you wouldn't. That's very patient of you. I had practice, he said. The drain took 4 months. She laughed. The laugh was clean and easy, the kind she'd been having more of since January, the kind that didn't surprise her anymore when it arrived. She moved to Silver Pines that summer. Not immediately, not impulsively, she spent 2 months finding a house in town, closer to the school, closer to the farmhouse, a place that was hers and Penny's, and that she'd chosen deliberately, because she understood herself well enough to know that she needed her own walls and her own front door, even when the person she wanted to be near was half a mile up the road. She negotiated a hybrid arrangement with Oramont's board 4 days in Denver, 3 days remote, a structure that required everyone to be more efficient with the time that was available, and that turned out, as these structures usually do, to produce better work than the endless hours model she'd built the company on originally. Penny started at Silver Pines Elementary in September. On her first day, Toby waited for her by the front entrance and walked her in, and Celeste stood by the truck and watched them go through the doors together, and had to turn away for a moment because the feeling that moved through her was too large for a school parking lot. They got married the following spring. It was not a large wedding. Maddox's position on the matter was that he'd done everything in his adult life either quietly or not at all, and this was not something he wanted to do loudly. Celeste's position was that she'd spent a decade in an industry that required constant performance, and she was done performing things that mattered. They agreed on this without argument, which was the first thing they'd agreed on entirely without argument, and they marked it. The ceremony was in the backyard of the farmhouse, on a Saturday in April, when the snow had melted enough that the grass was coming up in patches through what remained. Decker came, which nobody had doubted. 2 women from Oromont's executive team, who Celeste trusted, came, and they cried in the way of people who'd watched her work too hard for too long and were glad she'd found something else to work at. Maddox's former CO from his SEAL years drove from New Mexico and shook Maddox's hand for a long time without saying much, which was apparently what Maddox needed. Toby and Penny stood together at the edge of the proceedings, wearing their good clothes and watching with the seriousness of 2 children who understood that something was changing and had decided they were in favor of the change. Partway through, Penny reached over and took Toby's hand, not because she was scared, but because it was a significant occasion, and she felt it warranted the gesture. Toby let her hold it without comment, which from Toby was as eloquent as a speech. It was not a perfect afternoon. The officiant lost his place twice. The wind came up and blew several of the paper programs across the yard, and Decker spent part of the ceremony quietly collecting them from the grass. A chair collapsed under Maddox's former CO, who accepted this with the dignity of a man who had survived considerably worse, and they moved on. None of that mattered. None of it touched the actual thing, which was 2 people standing in a backyard in Colorado, saying true things to each other in the plainest language they could find, because neither of them had any patience left for the other kind. A year and a half later, on a Thursday evening in November, Maddox stood on the farmhouse porch watching the snow come down. It was the same kind of snow it had been the night he'd driven out to the Ridge Road and found an overturned luxury SUV with a woman and her daughter inside. Light at first, polite, the kind that made the valley look contained and clean. He watched it fall on the barn roof and the fence posts and the bare branches of the apple tree on the south side that had not produced apples in 2 years, and would apparently need to be dealt with in spring. The door opened behind him. Celeste came out, carrying 2 mugs, walking in the careful way of someone crossing a snowy porch in socks because she'd come outside impulsively and not stopped to put on boots. She handed him 1 mug and stood beside him. "Penny and Toby are arguing," she said. "About what? Whether a new rock Toby found qualifies as belonging to Gerald's family, or whether it's a separate household. The discussion is involved." He accepted this without surprise. "How's it going?" Penny believes it's an extended family situation. Toby thinks the geological composition is too different for a family designation, and is suggesting a neighbor relationship. She wrapped both hands around her mug. They'll be at it for a while. He looked out at the snow. The light from the windows behind them threw a warm rectangle across the porch floor, and beyond that, the dark and the white and the mountains that were invisible now in the cloud, but were absolutely there, the way they always were, regardless of what you could or couldn't see. He thought about a lot of things, standing there. He thought about Toby at 4 years old, sitting at this same kitchen table, asking him if he was going to be sad forever, and his own honest answer that he hadn't known. He thought about a 3-year stretch of days that he'd gotten through the way you get through things when there's no alternative, one at a time, without looking too far ahead, keeping the important things in the same place. He thought about a snowstorm in a ditch, and a woman who wouldn't tell him her name, but held her daughter like something worth protecting, and checked his eyes, the way people check eyes when they've learned not to trust the easy version of a stranger. He thought about all the ways he'd told himself that the farmhouse was enough, that Toby was enough, that the life he'd built in the years since had to be enough because wanting anything further was a kind of greed after what he'd already had. He'd been wrong about that. He'd been wrong in the specific way of a person who has confused loss with a permanent lowering of what's possible, who has learned to call shrinking by a braver name. "You're thinking," Celeste said. "Occupational hazard." "What about?" He was quiet for a moment. "How different it is than I thought it was going to be." She looked at him. "Better or worse?" He looked back. The snow fell between them and around them, and didn't care at all what the answer was. "Better," he said, "by a significant margin." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she leaned into his side, not dramatically, just a shift of weight, a resting of her shoulder against his arm, and looked back out at the snow. "I spent years believing," she said quietly, "that the way to protect Penny was to make sure we never needed anything we didn't have. Complete self-sufficiency. If we didn't require anything from anyone, then nothing could be taken." She paused. "That's a very clean system, logically, and it costs you everything warm."
Yeah.
She's arguing about rocks with a 9-year-old boy in there, and she's completely sure the house holds. That she can argue as loud as she wants and the house holds. She looked at the light on the porch floor. "I didn't know how to give her that in Denver. I didn't know that was what was missing." Maddox said nothing. He put his arm around her shoulders instead, the way you do when a thing has been said fully, and the right response is not more words. She leaned further in. From inside the house came Penny's voice, rising with the conviction of someone making a closing argument on a crucial point. It doesn't have to be the same kind of rock to be family, Toby. Family is about relationships, not composition. A beat. Then Toby's voice, measured and considering, that's actually a reasonable point. I need to think about it. Maddox looked at the window. Through it, he could see the kitchen, the two of them, at the table with the rocks between them. Penny gesturing with the particular authority of a child who's worked out exactly what she believes. Toby looking at the ceiling the way he did when he was genuinely reconsidering something. He looked at all of it. The mismatched chairs and the crack in the ceiling and the stack of Toby's books on the counter and Penny's jacket on the hook beside Toby's jacket and the evidence everywhere of a house that was fully inhabited, that had been expanded by people moving into it rather than through it. It was a small house, an old house with a slow drain and a barn that needed paint and an apple tree that might not make it to another season. It was nothing like the apartment in Denver with its architect portfolio views and its excellent security system and its dining table used as a document surface. It was, without question, the place. He didn't have a word for what he felt looking through that window. He'd never been good at the words for internal things that had been his wife's domain, and after her, he'd stopped expecting to need the vocabulary. But he felt it the way you feel things that are real and earned rather than wished for with the whole body, without any surprise in it, just a deep and tired and grateful recognition. He'd spent years protecting people. He'd done it in uniform and without it, in places where the stakes were other people's lives, and in a farmhouse in Colorado, where the stakes were a little girl who might or might not survive a snowstorm, and a woman who wouldn't give him her real name. He'd been good at protection. He'd been less good at letting himself be something more than the person doing the protecting. That was the thing he hadn't known he needed to learn. Not how to be braver, not how to be stronger, how to stay. How to let the house be warm, and let the warmth mean something, and not mistake the vulnerability of that for a weakness. Celeste had taught him that. Not by saying it, by doing it herself, badly and imperfectly, and with her own specific fears and resistances, moving towards something terrifying, because the alternative was a life that had everything in it, except the one thing that made the rest of it make sense. The snow kept coming down. The mountains stood behind it, silent and enormous, in the way they had been standing long before any of this, and would continue to stand after, indifferent to the particular human story unfolding in their shadow, a story that was not clean or simple or without its costs, but that was real in every place that mattered. Inside the farmhouse, Penny said, "Okay, neighbor," but a very close neighbor, like someone who comes for dinner. Toby said, "That works. What do we name him?" "Her," Penny said. "Obviously." A pause. "Okay," Toby said. Her Maddox heard Celeste make a small sound beside him, something softer, and she turned her face into his shoulder for a moment. He held his coffee in one hand and put his other arm around her and stood on the porch's farmhouse in the November snow, whilst his son and her daughter argued about whether a rock was a neighbor or a relative, and the warm light fell through the windows onto the snow, and the mountains held their ground in the dark, and nobody had to leave. That was everything. That was in the end exactly and completely everything.